I guess first and foremost, I'm just going to ask you some of the same questions you've been talking about all day, but were you surprised by this?
Well, I was surprised in terms, Katie, of the specific timing. When the president indicated the other day his 2-week window, I thought his preference would be for diplomacy to work. I actually thought that Donald Trump was enamored with the idea that he could somehow work this diplomatically. Plus, historically, he's been uncomfortable with the use of military force. It's never been a priority. It was obviously controversial with elements of his political base. So, in the narrow sense of the word, yes, I was surprised it happened when it did, as soon as it did. But I wasn't surprised in the larger sense. I actually thought this was inevitable. That we had made clear, we, the United States, that it was unacceptable that Iran would ever have a nuclear weapon or really be on the doorstep of that. And for years and years and years, Iran had been playing a game. Everybody knew they were not interested in electricity generation. They weren't enriching uranium to put the lights on in Tehran. You don't enrich uranium to 60 or 70% for that reason. So this was a game of cat and mouse. They'd been playing with the International Atomic Energy Agency, with Israel, with the United States. And I just thought at some time there would be a miscalculation. They would go too far and the rest of the world would say enough. And I think probably what led to it this time is also the Israelis felt they had options they didn't have before, with Hezbollah so defeated and so forth, that with Iran's air defenses so reduced, that I believe the Israelis basically said, okay, we've been tired of this for a long time, but now we can act pretty safely. So I think that's what led Israel to act. But again, I was somewhat surprised that the United States came in so quickly. I really did think that President Trump would first give diplomacy in the new context a little bit more time. He chose not to.
When he said to get, 2 weeks, and a lot of people were saying that's sort of something has said time and time again. I guess when he was saying that, he knew very well that the attack was imminent and the planning had already started. It was what they were in the thick of planning this.
Yeah, it looks a little bit like a ruse. I mean, twice now, first in the scheduling and the sixth round of talks with Iran in the run up to the Israeli initial attacks. And then just the other day, the 2-week time for diplomacy, last chance. The United States seemed to have used diplomacy, if you will, as a tactic to distract or almost to relax the Iranians. It seems to have worked potentially both times, but I'll be honest with you, I worry a little bit. It seems to me that we've raised questions about about, I guess it sounds corny, but about our sincerity when we say we're interested in diplomacy. And I wonder or worry at some point if that could come back to bite us somewhat.
Much has been made about these massive bombs that were needed to get
Yeah.
to these nuclear sites, particularly one that was wet, very much underground. So the Israeli military could have only done so much to degrade Iran's nuclear capability, and they needed to do significant damage. These huge, what are they called? What are those called?
The vernacular is bunker busters.
Bunker busters, which only the United States had carried on these, massive B-52s. So, um, this was something that the Israeli military could not have done on its own.
No, absolutely. The Israelis essentially took things pretty much as far as they could, which was pretty far. But they created an environment where the United States could bring in its aircraft, including stealth B-1s, with a high degree of confidence that there wouldn't be an intense air defense environment. And I think that was the case. Indeed, it was interesting in the Pentagon briefing this morning that they said there were no Iranian aircraft launched against them and there were no missiles launched against them. And to me, the interesting question from that was, did the Iranians make a calculated decision not to try to resist, or more likely, they weren't in a position to, that they simply didn't have the command and control. It's pretty hard to fight a war if you're very worried that your senior military leadership's being targeted. and so forth. But it was a pretty open environment. But your point's exactly right. The Israelis took it about as far as they could take it, and particularly against the Fordo facility. And there they needed the United States to bring in these large munitions, which are really quite a extraordinary. Now, what we don't know, here we are, however many hours later, we have no idea what was the effect. The president and others talked about it, shall we say, very as this was
Hyperbolically.
yes, there was yes a quality to the briefing that was slightly uncomfortable, shall we say? And the answer is you don't know. I mean, in my experience, bomb damage assessment or whatever you want to call it, it's a little bit of an art, not a science. You never have all the information. And my guess is, we don't know exactly as best, I would sense as yet what was, how much was accomplished. More important, we don't have a confident sense of put it one way, what percentage of the Iranian capability was not present in places we knew about.
Right.
How much it how much had they been able to park certain numbers of centrifuges or enriched uranium in garages and warehouses around the country? So even if we were fairly successful at these 3 sites, what I don't know is, you can't destroy what you don't know about.
Well, that's interesting. I just talked to David Frum and I brought that up, and he said that he thought significant damage has been done. But I guess the question, Richard, is will we ever know? I mean, everything is so difficult to ascertain in Iran where these plants are, where they're taking these centrifuges, how much enriched uranium do they have? I mean, will we ever have an accurate um, understanding of the damage, the extent of the damage?
Look, it's a good question. My guess is we'll never have 20/20 vision for 2 reasons. One is the Iranians can't be expected to tell the truth, and secondly, my guess is the days of Iranian cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, with the global watchdogs, is probably over. Henceforth, or their going forward, their program is not going to be one, shall we say, that will have a cooperative monitoring verification dimension. So my guess is we may never know for sure, particularly if they want to reconstitute their program, which is
Well,
quite possible.
and I want to talk because I know that's an interesting point you made this morning. It was perhaps reconstitution versus retaliation. But before we talk about the impact, Richard, and what comes next, I'd love to just ask you a couple questions about the
Sure.
run up to this military action. Congress, the two Democratic leaders of Congress were not notified, just the Republicans. And a lot of people, I think, I'm always confused about the War Powers Act because it seems to me that it's often not followed by presidents. And I guess the question is, uh, should the Trump administration try to get congressional approval, or should they have, at the very least, talked to the two Democratic leaders, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, just as they talked to Mike Johnson and John Thune?
So a couple of reactions, because these are big questions. Under the War Powers Act, you're not required to get advanced approval. You have a window after you do something in order to inform either the entire Congress or a select subset. Indeed, I remember back, Katie, when I was a kid in the 70s and the War Powers Act was being considered in the Congress. There were those who worried that it would actually give the executive more leeway to use force because it opened up something that was not in the Constitution. Constitution only talks about declarations of war. Well, it turns out we almost never declare war, and presidents use force with, shall we say, regularity. It was what 50 or 60 years ago that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote the famous essay and then book about the imperial presidency and the
Right.
whole idea that presidents kind of use military force a lot without checking in with Congress. So I don't see that as in and of itself fundamentally new. And virtually every president, Republican and Democrat, takes takes an awful lot of what latitude, discretion, when initiative when it comes to using military force. I think it is bad form. It violates the norm to tell people of one party and not the other. to politicize it that way. It's one thing not to ask for congressional approval. It's something else only to tell leaders of one party. That I hadn't heard that. That seems to me unfortunate. That just further uh, politicizes something that, quite honestly, ought not to be politicized that way. But I do think the larger point is that this president, like his predecessors, tends to see, in a rather expansive way, his ability to use military force. A lot of people, I understand, listening to this, watching this, don't like that, feel we ought to get congressional approval. And something like this, they actually, had they done it weeks or months ago, they could have. In a funny sort of way, there was no reason they couldn't have gotten agreement in principle to do this type of a preventive attack, because there was nothing about this, and you and I talked about this the other day, that dealt with, if you will, tactical warning, where we only had minutes or hours to act. This was all an American decision to act against a gathering threat. So if the administration had wanted to, almost like George H.W. Bush did in the run-up to Desert Storm, this administration could have gone to Congress and said, hey, if we ever get intelligence that suggests that Iran is getting very close to nuclear weapons, we want to get Congress on record as authorizing us to use military force to stop it. They might have even gotten Congress to approve it. It's not far fetched. But in any case, they didn't go that way.
I guess I tried to do a lot of Google searches this morning, trying to read different sources about how close the Iranians were to actually having nuclear capabilities. And I saw this chart, which I think Fareed showed as well, where after Donald Trump got rid of the Iranian nuclear agreement that I guess had been brokered in 2015, it just went up so significantly in terms of how much uranium it was enriching. And I guess it has to go to 90% in order to make it weapons grade. And anyway, I guess the question is, and David Frum said this really was not the right question. I guess because he was saying that you have to strike when you have an opportunity. And in recent months, the Iranian military and their proxies like Hezbollah, et cetera, had been significantly degraded. But it still makes me wonder, and I think you and I talked about this before, is there any way of knowing how close the Iranians were or are to developing nuclear weapons?
It seems to me there's two halves of it. One is the enriched material, the amount and the quality or level of enrichment. The other is everything else that goes into a weapon. The International Atomic Agency, the IAEA, announced just days before the Israeli strike, that the Iranians had accumulated quite a lot, and to have it enriched to something like 60% is almost all the way there. I don't quite understand the physics and the math, but to get from
Right.
60% to 90% is relatively easy. It's getting the first few percent that's the hardest. So the Iranians had enough material for 9 bombs, I think it was. Again, this is preposterous that their program was about electricity generation. So let's just put that out there. A bigger question was how far they were from actual weaponization. The best thing I've read on that was in The Economist the other day, a so-called dossier, and the Israelis and others has put it together. Still uncertain. And my guess is months, though, again, you never know what you don't know. And I think what the Israeli reaction was a little bit almost like us after 9/11. I was against the Iraq War, but there were those in the George W. Bush administration, like Dick Cheney and others, who said, look, we can't take any risk, even if there's only a 1% chance that Saddam Hussein could have these weapons of mass destruction. We've got to act. I think the Israelis were a little bit like that after October 7th. They had run out of any tolerance for uncertainty. So that
Well,
plus
you can
the
understand that,
100%. And that plus the more benign strategic environment with the weakening of Hezbollah. So I understand why they did what they did. And again, I understand why we did what we did. Again, I think you can have an argument about whether we ought to have given diplomacy a little bit more time, whether we should have done more consultations with Congress or the allies. I get it. Those are legitimate questions. But I think the basic direction of U.S. policy here was probably right, because the Iranians were not their program was not a good faith program consistent with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I think this was kind of baked into the cake, and it was a question of when more than if this was bound to happen.
Do you feel this even if the Iranian nuclear agreement that came together in 2015, even if President Trump in his first term hadn't gotten rid of that, do you still think we would be at this point?
May
Because
maybe not quite as soon, but ultimately, yes. Because that agreement, as you'll recall, had various what were called sunset provisions, where various things would expire. And so my hunch is certain things would have expired. The Iranians might not have, probably wouldn't have re-upped. And also, again, there were ways they could have done things, they could have worked around it without full disclosure. So again, my sense was the 2015 agreement didn't solve the problem. At most, it parked it or managed it
Mhm.
for a time. So I really think this was inevitable, that the Iranians had ambitions. And again, I don't know exactly how far they were down the road of realizing those ambitions, but the direction of what they wanted was clear. And so what Israel and ultimately the United States chose to do, if it wasn't 2025, it could have happened in 2028, but neither country rightfully was prepared to wake up one day and basically have the North Korean experience repeated. I remember the debate, so 'cause I was involved in it. We chose not to attack North Korea early on in its program simply because we were worried that if we attacked them to take out their nascent nuclear program, this would trigger an enormous war on the peninsula. You'd have a second Korean War, and people shied away from it. And here we are, what, 30 years later, with a North Korean arsenal of some 50 nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. People are not prepared to have that happen with Iran. It's almost that simple.
Yeah. Well, what do you think? Well, let's talk about the impact of this. It sounds to me, Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, that you think this was a perfectly legitimate and understandable use of U.S. force.
I would have gone about it differently. I would have done a little bit more careful work on giving diplomacy a visible chance. I would have consulted more domestically and internationally, but directionally, yes, I am comfortable with what we did.
All right. Well, let's talk about the aftermath because I think there's fear about obviously this war expanding. There's so many questions about well, I guess we should start by saying what you think Iran will do. And I know that you said reconstitute its nuclear weapons program is a real possibility, that they'll be not really emboldened, but sort of, I don't even know what the right word is, nervous that they need to speed it up, right? They need to get going and have nuclear capabilities given what happened to them, right? And that would be a deterrent from this kind of attack, correct?
100%. I think that will be a principal strategic conclusion reached in Tehran, that the way that Israel and the United States have attacked them, this sort of thing would not happen if Iran had nuclear weapons. They will say they don't attack North Korea, they don't attack Russia, blah, blah, blah. And they'll say, therefore, we can no longer afford to be this vulnerable. So I think one of the strategic takeaways in Iran will be if they can get away with it, and that's on us in Israel to try to prevent, but that will be a long-term proposition. So I think that'll be a priority for them. You raised the question of retaliation. I've been thinking about it a lot. My guess is that might not be a priority. If I were if I were a betting man, which of course I'm not, Katie, but if I were, I would think the Iranians would put an emphasis on regime strength, that the regime has been shaken by what Israel and now the US has done. Economically, they've got real problems. A lot of their leadership's been, killed. So my guess is in the short run, they're probably gonna focus most on regime maintenance or consolidation rather than retaliation against us, which then risks our response to their retaliation. And I think long-term reconstitution of their nuclear program. So of those 3 priorities, nuclear reconstitution, regime maintenance, and retaliation, I would say retaliation might be number 3 on that list, which doesn't mean I'm not gonna sit here and say it won't happen or can happen, but I would not be surprised if it didn't happen in a large way or if it didn't happen soon. The old expression, revenge is a dish best served cold. They might decide to put it off for a while because again, I think they have other priorities right now.
Yeah, okay. I have some follow-ups on two of those things, that first and the second. So reconstituting their nuclear program. How difficult is that to do? I mean, obviously, we don't know what they've been doing, but is the International Atomic Energy Agency completely kind of useless? I don't want to say useless, but is it just not particularly effective in monitoring the activity going on inside of Iran? Could they conceivably, having, let's say, hypothetically moving some of these centrifuges or whatever, some of this nuclear material to undisclosed locations, could they really do that secretly? How hard would that be to reconstitute their program? By the way, everyone, you probably recognize my friend Richard Haass. Well, I think we're on your thing. So
Yeah, I was going to say
I'm
you
Katie, by the
probably
way, and I'm on
recognize my
Richard's
friend.
Substack.
This is my friend Katie Couric. So
Yeah.
the two things. One is the International Atomic Energy Agency, if you'll pardon the expression, is a gentleman's agreement. And by that I mean it's cooperative. So countries say, here are our facilities that are in the nuclear business. Please come inspect them. The IAEA goes, thank you very much. Sometimes they'll be given intelligence from others and say, we'd like to inspect these places, and governments then have to agree to let them in. But it's all done through cooperation. Uh, I don't think Iran we can count on that. So I think the way we would ever be able to learn that Iran was reconstituting would be through things like American intelligence, Israeli intelligence, what have you. And it seems to me the Israelis have the best intelligence on the ground of what's going in Iran. We probably have the best intelligence, if you will, from the air. But I can't give you a straight answer, a confident answer saying, we would for sure know that Iran was doing some things. You never know what you don't know. I actually assume the opposite. I would assume right now in Iran, there's bits of enriched uranium squirreled away in places we don't know about. I would assume there's weapons laboratories and experimentation that is going on in places we don't know about. There's obviously know how inside of people's heads, and we haven't killed all the nuclear scientists. So I would assume elements either exist or could come into existence. Now, nuclear programs usually take a bit of engineering and production, so they're hard to hide completely. But
Mhm.
could it happen? Absolutely. Could it? And they could do enough things in enough places and then suddenly bring them together. I think it's difficult, but not inconceivable.
Let's talk about the second thing, the outcome, which is bolstering the current regime. How difficult will that be to do? And if the regime, like let's say a lot of the top leadership has been killed, Richard, and the regime is kind of shaky right now, could this be an opportune time for a mass uprising, or does that, not simply not end well?
A lot of people are asking that question, Katie. Traditionally, if there's going to be regime change, it tends to have to come from within. I don't think a time where Israel and the United States have bombed Iran is probably the optimal circumstance or context. I think it puts Iranians
For it to come from within.
exactly. I think it makes it hard because people who have zero sense, Iranians who see this regime as incompetent, corrupt, whatever, intolerant, uh, they have to be careful not to get portrayed as being unpatriotic and siding with the United States and Israel at this moment. So I think it creates a difficult political context for regime change to take place. I also think, a lot of Iranians still support this regime. I don't have hard numbers. I don't think anybody does. But we've seen in the past that while there were a lot of people who were pro-reform and favored much more openness and tolerance and ties to the West and women's rights, a lot of Iranians clearly have a different agenda. I just think that if it's going to happen, if regime change is going to happen, it really has to boil up from within. And I don't think it can come in, if you will, behind American and Israeli aircraft or missiles. I just don't think this sets the stage for it.
There also seemed to be a sentiment, sort of a pride in sovereignty when all of this was being discussed
Mhm.
before the attack, that, you know, even for the people who didn't like the regime, correct me if I'm wrong, but I sense kind of this feeling that this is our country, you cannot be telling us what to do. We may not like the leadership, but it is our country.
100%. And also one other thing, I remember conversations I had when I was in government when people would press for regime change in Iraq or other places. Bibi Netanyahu or so let's take Bibi Netanyahu, whose government clearly wants regime change in Iran. Their defense minister was explicit about it the other day. You can want it, but as we used to say, that's a hope, not a strategy. There's nothing that Bibi Netanyahu could decide that any of his senior military or intelligence people could say, okay, you allow me to do X, Y, and Z, and I can promise you regime change in 4 days. It doesn't work that way. It's just there's no way to translate the hope into policy that you can have any confidence would work. I also think the United States, by the way, is wise not to associate itself with it. Again, I don't think it can be done. There's no guarantee it would turn out better. Also, I thought in the briefing in the Pentagon, I thought they sent two pretty interesting messages today, Katie. One was we, the United States, carried out these strikes with a very narrow goal. It was anti nuclear. We weren't trying to hurt the Iranian people. We weren't trying to bring about regime change. It was their way of saying, we didn't have larger goals. We had a narrow goal, so you don't need to retaliate. We don't have bigger plans. And the second message they sent, but by the way, if you do retaliate, we are operating at such a more capable level that you're going to regret it. So I thought the Pentagon briefing, strip away of all the rhetorical excess and the rest, actually sent an interesting point that the United States is not associating itself with the regime change. We had one interest, anti-nuclear. We acted on it. So we're not looking to do more.
But I guess the question is if there is some kind of form of retaliation, right? Which brings us to number three. Let's say there are sporadic terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
Let's say that U.S. forces in the region are attacked by whatever is left of the Iranian military. Let's say there are unacceptable forms of retaliation. What will the United and they have to, you know, basically carry out this nearly unlimited threat of American power. Uh, how on a scale of 1 to 10, how fearful are you that the United States is going to be dragged into a longer, more protracted conflict?
Well, if Iran chooses to retaliate, whether it's going after the 40,000 US troops in the region, attacking US citizens or maybe businesses in the region or here in the United States, there's always rumors of sleeper cells. They could do stuff in cyberland. Um, then I believe we would feel compelled to respond. And it would be Groundhog Day in the sense that, think about it. Since the Cold War ended, we did the Gulf War, then we did the Iraq War, we did Afghanistan, we did Libya. You go on and on and on. And now this. And the idea that the Middle East has become the principal arena of America's involvement in the world rather than, say, Asia, which is going to really determine the 21st century, or Europe, which was the center of the world for the 20th century and still is important now, given what Russia's doing to Ukraine. It's strategically, you kind of shake your head and you go, we do not want this to be the epicenter of American national security policy. This is not where the other great powers are. This is not where history is going to be decided. There's got to be some people in Russia and China who are cheering this on and will say, go Americans, get bogged down in the Middle East. Use up your diminished arsenals of tomahawks and other weapons so you won't have them to give to Ukraine or, what have you. You won't be able to help Taiwan. So I certainly hope that we don't get into a tit for tat, ever escalating scenario with Iran, because I just don't think it's in our larger strategic interest to go down that path, which is why, can I just take a step back and say, which is why this was so difficult? we have a really powerful reason to see that Iran does not get nuclear weapons, and we have really powerful considerations to see that we don't get bogged down in the Middle East. I get both. And that's why foreign policy is hard.
Yeah. And in terms of Bibi Netanyahu, let's talk about the political sort of impact of these things. Oh, by the way, I want to be responsive to people who follow you. Everyone get Richard's newsletter, Home and Away. It's excellent. But somebody named Nancy, hi, Nancy Trowbridge, said, what about Marco Rubio saying this morning they didn't need intelligence for the operation?
I don't know what that means that they didn't
Yeah, I
need
don't know. I
intelligence.
don't know when he said that.
I don't know how you do targeting. The targeting is that does require intelligence. So I didn't hear what the secretary
Yeah, I
said.
didn't hear that either,
By the way, the
Nancy.
operation, can I say, I thought, the operation, whatever you think about it politically, was technically really impressive.
Right?
What was done.
I thought so too, from everything I was hearing. I thought that General Kane did a good job, um, at the press briefing. Well, so Nancy's very active questioner. She wants to know, and let me just go through a couple things I wanted to talk to you about, Richard, and then I
Sure.
know we both have to go. But Um, you mentioned China and Russia saying, "Go for it," US get involved here. W What do you think their reaction other than are they gonna try to keep at arm's length from this conflict?
Interesting question. I've been thinking about it too, Katie. China imports a significant amount of oil from Iran. China's a significant oil importer. Chinese economy's got some real pressures on it. So I don't think China is looking for a major conflict in the Middle East that would raise the price of energy significantly. So I think they'd like to see things, all things being equal, toned down a bit. Russia's just the opposite. I think for Russia, this is pretty good. If the price of energy goes up, Russia's an energy exporter. Second of all, it distracts the world from Ukraine. I mean, look the other day what happened at the G7 meeting in Canada. It was as if President Zelensky could barely get any airtime. He it was almost like that was, oh yeah, well, we know we still have that crisis, but we now got to focus on this new one. And I was thinking, if you're Vladimir Putin watching that, you go, oh, that's pretty interesting. Uh, some of the wind went out of the sails, if you will, of keeping the Ukraine issue front and center. So for various reasons, I would think that Russia, and then the other one I mentioned before, that it would draw down U.S. munitions. I would think Russia would not half mind if the situation here percolated pretty high.
Um, Sorry, I know my head is swimming with so many questions for you, Richard. What about, you mentioned sleeper cells. What about these sort of terrorist actions? How likely do you think those are? Because that scares me.
Scares me too. I don't know. I would simply say, if you're Iran, the first question is whether to retaliate. We talked about that already. And my own view
Right.
is it's probably not their party. The other is how to retaliate if you are. What worries me about things like cyber or terrorism is, if you're Iran, that makes more sense, because you would argue essentially it's asymmetric. They can't match us or Israel advanced aircraft for advanced aircraft. They can't, if you will, fight a war at that advanced level of technology. That doesn't play to their strength. What plays to their strength is war much more in the shadows. That's where the cyber and the terrorism and proxies and assassinations and so forth comes in. So that's what worries me. If I were going to imagine types of Iranian retaliation, it would probably be more in the shadows rather than something, if you will. It's not going to be on the battlefield. They can't win that kind of a war. That's where, again, asymmetry. If they are tempted to retaliate, I would think asymmetric retaliation would be the most tempting.
What do you see as the role of US allies moving forward? Trump done a pretty good job alienating a lot of those allies, right? Can he get them to come back into the fold?
Well, it's not clear what they really have to do right now. I mean, that was really curious to me. And Fareed and I talked about it a little bit this morning, that this administration it's not isolationist now, it's unilateralist. It wanted to act, didn't care much about allied considerations. My hunch is the allies are caught. They're uncomfortable with this sort of thing. On the other hand, they didn't want Iran to get nuclear weapons either. I'm not sure what we're really going to ask them to do. I don't think they're front and center here. I think they are front and center with Ukraine, and they've got their hands full there. They're front and center with, as the United States gets more involved in the Middle East, worries about Taiwan, and as you said, doesn't care much about our traditional allies. I think they're dealing with the reality that increasingly they're going to have to become strategically self-sufficient. That the era they could depend on the United States to be the cavalry has probably faded. So I don't really see the allies at the moment all that central to this as it plays out. I think it's more an Israeli-Iran dynamic in the first place, a US-Iran dynamic. Iran's gonna have to think about its relations with some of its Arab neighbors, et cetera, but I don't think the Europeans are front and center right now.
Yeah, okay. This is what I wanted to ask you about Bibi Netanyahu politically. How my daughter's calling me, I'll call her back. Politically,
Maybe she'd like to join.
what what
Ellie, come
impact
on
do
up.
you think? It seems to me that Israelis are pretty united in appreciating what has happened with nobody in Israel wants Iran to have nuclear capabilities. This is only a net positive for Bibi Netanyahu, correct?
Correctamente, very much so. That, Israelis who detest Bibi Netanyahu because of the democracy debate, who detest him because of Gaza or the West Bank, you name it, they are pretty behind him on this. Even most Israeli quote unquote doves agree with him that Iran can't be allowed to get nuclear weapons and have to err on the side of better to act sooner rather than too late. And I think that, again, that was part of the general reaction to October 7th, is that twice in their lives, in 73 and October 7th now, Israelis have been sanguine, overconfident about their defense. And it's a pretty widespread perception now that that's a massive, massive error. So yeah, Bibi Netanyahu, this is good for him politically. It's distracting. There's a rally round the flag thing. This is not controversial for the most part. So yeah, this is for him very, very good. Politically, he still has, I don't know, what, 15, 16 months to go before he has to hold another election. But this is, yeah, if on one side of the ledger you have October 7th and all the anger over democracy or Gaza, this is on the other side of the ledger. This with Hezbollah, the change in Syria, and so forth, that he has remade a lot of the strategic map of the Middle East, and he has obviously set back the emergence of a Iranian nuclear threat by a significant amount, and that politically it really bolsters him.
And as somebody who's worked for, different administrations, what impact do you think this will have on Donald Trump's popularity?
It's a great question. Been thinking about that too. My guess is he will survive for the time being, the debate or dissent within MAGAville over having done this. There's a kind of a rally around Donald Trump. My guess a lot of this is going to depend upon how it plays out. And if, for argument's sake, where what we posited here is right, that Iran does not emphasize near-term retaliation, that the United States does not get bogged down into some type of a large Middle East situation, I think it helps Donald Trump. That it makes him look decisive, and he acted to reduce a threat, and we didn't pay a big price for it. So I think it could potentially help him. He didn't get the big diplomatic win he hoped for, but this would be seen as a major strategic win. I think what would hurt him is if this does turn into sort of an open-ended, if you want to call it war of attrition of sorts, where we increasingly take losses and so forth. So I think a lot of the political judgment here depends upon how this plays out over the next couple of years.
And finally, Richard, we're talking about other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia. We're talking about, you know, this whole area. of the Middle East and the balance of power and alliances. And I'm curious how you see this shifting those, if at all.
I think a lot of these countries are caught. Look, they have no love for Iran. And so the idea that Iran gets cut down to size makes a lot of the Arab countries pretty happy. On the other hand, they've got to be worried today that if there is an Iranian retaliation, it could be against them. That one of the options Iran would have is to widen the war against Saudi Arabia, the UAE, what have you. I think probably the Saudis and some of the others are, like the Israelis, probably impressed by what they see as Trump's decisiveness. I think that will play pretty well again, so long as the Iranians don't make them pay a price uh, for it. And by the way, what one another reason the Iranians won't make them pay a price for it is Iran needs to export its oil. And if you've noticed, the Israelis and the Americans both did not target Iran's big export terminal.
Hmm.
And if the Iranians start mucking around with the oil installations, facilities, or the flow of oil through the straits, they're obviously vulnerable themselves. I'm not sure the Iranian economy could easily withstand that. So I think the other countries are pretty content right now, but uneasy. I say one other thing, Katie. If Iran ever did get nuclear weapons, there would be a massive move in Saudi Arabia and somewhat probably Egypt, Turkey, maybe other countries that they need to match it because that would be seen as they couldn't depend on us to deter it. And I want to avoid that scenario. As bad as the Middle East is, and when we think of the Middle East, it's a part of the world where you tell history by the wars. I don't want a Middle East to come about where you have 3 or 4 nuclear weapon states. I mean, high on anyone's list of nightmares, uh, that ought to be on it. So that's why, again, I think it's so important because if Iran were ever to cross that threshold, that would not be the last Middle Eastern country to cross that threshold. And just like Pakistan followed India, and quite honestly, we could be setting this in motion in Asia. If South Korea or Japan come to doubt American protection, I can imagine them having big conversations, particularly South Korea, about needing nuclear weapons of their own. I don't want the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Turks and others to have that conversation and to go down that path. The transition to a world of nuclear weapons could be unbelievably destabilizing, and a world of nuclear weapons could be unbelievably uh, destabilizing. So that's why, again, I think it's important to keep what happened in perspective and to say, even if people preferred it didn't happen now or done differently, the idea that Iran is cut off from getting too far down that path, I think whatever complications this cause, it might prevent other complications that are even greater.
Well, as you said earlier, foreign policy is hard.
It is. When I used to teach, that was I said the bad news is it's hard. The good news is it's pretty interesting and it matters a lot. But this is actually as good a case study as you could find because you look at the options that were facing us and so forth. Not easy. You look at the options. Imagine you were an Iranian senior official. The options they have. Um, these are not. There's nothing clear cut about this. It's really complicated. And there's no option that only has upsides and no downsides.
Right.
Right,
Well,
and you're also
hopefully,
I
I
said, well,
was
I think you're always making the decisions with imperfect information. The other part one of the many reasons foreign policy is so hard is Donald Trump loves card metaphors. Well, you're not playing with 52 cards face up. And so you've gotta make big decisions with great unknowns, and I think that's what we're seeing.
Well, Richard, I'm always so grateful for your time, your intelligence, your expertise, and I always I start to understand all these things a little bit better every
Okay,
time I
man.
talk to you. So, Richard, thank you, and let's hopefully we can stay in touch and continue these conversations as events warrant. I'm going to be going on vacation for 2 weeks with my daughters, and I'm really going to
Excellent.
try not to focus too much on this, but but the timing of this is gonna be challenging. So, Richard, thank you.
No, thank you, Katie. Have a wonderful vacation. I hope I don't hear from you for 2 weeks.
There's
But
no
so
guarantee. You know I'm crazy, so I'll text you, I'm sure, a few times.
okay, you take care of yourself. Be safe and be well.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Richard.
you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.